we're hearing that both of these factors are increasing rent prices and house prices. And that if we just deliver like rapid house building at any cost, rents and house prices will come down.
After 9 years, this Prime Minister is not worth the cost of housing, which has doubled since he took office. Rent and mortgage payments continue to rise. That is because they, under this Prime Minister, are building bureaucracy rather than building homes. My common sense plan is the Building Homes, Not Bureaucracies Act. It seeks to do exactly what it says. Less bureaucracy, more home building.
The system has never quite worked. And so to say that there is a crisis and to sound surprised and shocked, I think is a little bit misleading. Our housing system is designed to generate profit and provide high returns on investment, and is doing that very, very well.
Welcome to Spring Radio, a podcast for socialist ideas in action. I'm Ayan Tani, Spring member and co-host of the Spring Radio podcast. In this episode, we continue our series examining Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre's rhetoric and policies in his bid to become Prime Minister of Canada. Poilievre tabled this private member's bill in the fall of 2023, and while it did not pass, private members' bills rarely do, this housing strategy remains central to his campaign. It's no surprise as to why. According to the latest Canadian social survey, nearly half of Canadians reported being very concerned about housing affordability. His big idea? Increase housing supply through privatization and deregulation. He wants to sell off federal land to the private sector, remove protections for renters like rent control, and cut taxes for developers and property investors. For Poilievre, slashing red tape, taxes, and regulations will lead to affordable housing. Infrastructure Canada's analysis, however, paints a different picture. The department found the bill to be flawed, explaining that it does not provide definitions for core terms and fails to take into account renters and other types of housing outside of ownership. With a third of households renting rising to 68% in Montreal, this narrow focus on homeownership is out of touch with reality for many people living in Canada. Renters are twice as likely as owners to spend over 30% of their income on housing, a key measure of unaffordable housing. At the same time, Statistics Canada reports that a combination of rising housing prices and low interest rates make landlordism increasingly profitable. This persistent gap raises a crucial question. Are we facing an affordability crisis or a housing system based on structural inequality and economic exploitation? That's the argument Ricardo Tranjan makes in his little red book, The Tenant Class. Pocket-sized for easy distribution, The Tenant Class is a fresh manifesto to recognize tenants as a distinct political class and dispel myths about renters, mom-and-pop landlords, and housing affordability. He writes that an alternative, just housing system requires landlords and developers to give up high profits, which they won't consent to. It takes a struggle. We're seeing this struggle play out right now in Toronto's Chinatown, where tenants of a rooming house owned by Wynn's Flowers have launched the neighborhood's first ever rent strike over deplorable living conditions.
The context that we're here today is Wynn's Flowers have been treating the tenants that live here extremely, extremely poorly. These tenants have come together in a show of camaraderie and bravery to say to Jenny that this is unacceptable and this will not continue.
Spring member Josh Frame sat down with Ricardo to discuss Canada's housing situation, competing political narratives around housing solutions, and the importance of tenant organizing.
Hello, thank you so much, Ricardo, for being on the Spring podcast for this episode in our series on Pierre Poilievre and I guess more the run-up to the federal elections. So we're really pleased to have you on.
I'm happy to be here. Thanks again for the invitation.
Yeah, great. So, the reason we were really keen to have you on this episode is because we're looking at Pierre Poilievre and kind of his phrases in the run-up to the election. And one of them is build the homes. And that's kind of what we're wanting to focus on. And we were really drawn by your book. And we loved it on the podcast team. Just because of the extra focus it gives on tenants. And I'm sure we'll get into a bit of that. But I guess my first question is really just the central, maybe controversial claim of the book. You say that the term crisis might not be a great term to describe the current state of high rents. So obviously people have really been feeling the pinch recently. But I think what you mean is that we're not facing maybe simply an economic shock, but something maybe a bit more structural. And you use some news clippings in the book to demonstrate the kind of long-standing historical nature of this. So I was wondering if you could explain what you mean when you say that we're not in a crisis.
Mm-hmm. So let me start by saying that there is a large and growing number of people who are experiencing material hardship, who are experiencing housing security, and that's real, it's concrete, and people are getting really hurt out there. I do acknowledge that. But I think the term housing crisis is not the best way to describe it, because when we keep talking about how the housing crisis, it leads us to perhaps accept the notion that we had at one point a housing system that worked for everybody, or a housing system that was focused on affordability, that was focused on extending housing security universally, or at least to a large number of people. And that has never been the case for decades and decades, and like nearing a century. In Canada, the focus has been on providing access to the middle class to home ownership, where they can individually take risks and hopefully stand to gain from the investment, and also get housing security out of it. And then to a large part of the population, roughly 1/3, and pretty constantly, it's been kind of roughly 1/3, governments have told them, good luck in the private rental market. You go out there and fend for yourself, and maybe you're going to find something that's suitable for you, maybe not. And then to a very small share of the population who have very low incomes, we have more or less accepted that they will need some sort of income supports or subsidizing housing because the private sector will not deliver. That is the structure of the housing system in Canada. Homeownership, if you can. If you can't, good luck with the private rental market. And if you're very poor, maybe you get some sort of subsidized housing. Write down your name on this wait list. Go home and wait for a few years. You might get a call. So the system has never quite worked. And so to say that there is a crisis and to sound surprised and shocked, I think is a little bit misleading. Our housing system is designed to generate profit and provide high returns on investment, and it's doing that very, very well.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense. I like that explanation of it really just being it's baked into the very nature of the housing market. And I think what really attracted me to your book in the first place, in the Tenant Class, and why we thought it was really great to dig into for this series, is because it does focus on that left out third of people that you're talking about. Because it seems like just in general in the Western world, I mean, I'm from the UK and we have this as well, the political class is really focused on house prices and homeowners. And I don't think there's anything wrong with owning a house per se. In the previous episode, though, in the series, we talked about inflation, and we talked a bit about rentier capitalism and how prosperity in society, as you're talking about, is dependent on being part of this asset-owning class. And in that way, we're not even a kind of social democracy. We're like a nation. We're just a nation of homeowners and asset owners, and your security, like you're saying, is tied to whether you own a home or not. And I guess, I mean, you're saying it's fairly constant, but I wonder if you comment on this. Is especially for my generation, we're seeing more people never being able to get on the housing ladder, for example. And in this system, that means there could be a larger class of renters and workers who are locked out of buying homes and who face a high degree of insecurity in their housing, amongst other areas in their lives. Meanwhile, they continuously have this greater and greater share of their wages eaten by landlords and this kind of rentier class more generally. So yeah, I guess my second question around that was, could you explain a little bit about your analysis of the class element there that you mentioned in the book? What do you mean by the tenant class? What do you mean by the landlord class? And also, why did you decide it was important to address the needs of tenants specifically?
Yes, just to pick up on what you said on this focus on home ownership. Of course, from a worker's perspective, there's nothing wrong with owning a home. Ideally, you're not going to have two bosses, like deal with one boss all day at work and then come home to another boss. It's not an ideal situation. So a lot of the sort of working class impetus to acquire and own a home is to free yourself from that second boss, right? And in that sense, it's really positive. But from a broader social policy perspective, the exaggerated emphasis on home ownership is explained by the fact that has been used as a way for governments to essentially privatize Social Security, especially old age security. So instead of investing in programs whereby we collect revenues, we invest them collectively, and we use them collectively, ensuring that everyone has a safety net and everyone has sort of a standard, particular basic standard of living and some decent pensions for when they retire. Instead of doing that, the government's going to say, okay, here, we're going to help you to put a down payment on a home, and you're going to indebt yourself and by a lot. And that house is now your private equity, and you're taking the risk on your own, and whatever earnings that you make, that's what you're going to live off, right? So is essentially has been used now for decades in Canada as a mechanism to privatize Social Security. And the political gain in that more recently has been in all of these kind of boutique policies that do not address the structural causes of high increase and like skyrocketing house prices and skyrocketing rents, but instead continues to sell the sort of the white picket fence dream to the Canadian middle class. So we've seen since 2017 with the government of Justin Trudeau and with the development of the National Housing Strategy, almost every federal budget has something there, has little, crumbs there for the middle class. And it's a tax-free savings account to saving for your down payment, is a reduction of the requirements for your down payment. Most recently has been the extension of the mortgage for 25 to 30 years. All of these policies are doing two things. At the individual level, it's allowing households to indebt themselves more. At the macro level, it's injecting more credit into the housing market, which helps to inflate the cost of houses. But it looks like help. And it's way more popular to do that than to tell households that I'm sorry, but allowing you to take a mortgage that is 6 times your total annual income is not sustainable. We're going to bring that back down to 2 to 3 times, which was what it was in the early 80s, for example. That would be very unpopular. So I think that's kind of explains a little bit the helps to explain a little bit the focus on home ownership. But now I need you to repeat the question again, because we went on a very long tangent.
Great sidetrack. No, I'm not sidetracked at all, actually. No, that's a really, thank you for the explanation. Cause yeah, I mean, it really does feel like most of this is, focused on homeowners and house prices. Yeah, my question was, could you explain your analysis of the class element of that? You talk about the tenant class and the landlord class. What do you mean by these two classes? I know you talk a bit about, for example, in the landlord class, you're talking in the book about some of the myths around that as well, because it feels like in that development of the third of people who become tenants, they're open to this system of exploitation. They're locked out of the white picket fence dream. And there isn't a social safety net because it's been privatized in the way you're talking about, and it leaves them open to exploitation in this way. Which is like a really key bit of the book. So I was wondering if you could explain a bit about that and, why you decided it was important to address the needs of tenants in the class of tenants specifically in this way?
Yes, the term class is a tricky one. I used in the title of the book, and I didn't go into too much sort of discussion of it in the first or second chapter, because I didn't want it to derail the conversation. We're really trying to make something accessible that read more as a short manifesto than sort of an academic analysis. But the reason for using class, there's two different sets of reasons for using the term tenant class and focusing on it. The first, I think it is defensible to say that today it is one of the key factors explaining income and wealth inequality. It is a key line where some will benefit from the current economic system and others will not. And I know your audience, and I know a lot of people are thinking, we read Engels, we read the housing question, and class, that fundamental distinction only happens at the point of production. Housing happens at the point of consumption. Therefore, there can't be a tenant class. It's really the working class that is the core division that we should focus on. I get that argument, but I think we need to revisit it. I think nowadays, I think the arguments first is a little bit gendered, that it focuses too much in production and not in reproduction. When you think about like reproduction, it takes place, within a house or a household of some sort, and if you don't own that space, and if you're subject to the arbitrary will of someone else in order to do that important reproductive work, where does that leave you? Isn't that comparable in some ways with what we see with production and at the factory floor sort of thing? The other thing we have to take into account is obviously financialization and the way money is moving around right now, and that sort of advanced capitalism and how that real estate fits into that new sort of frontier of capitalist development, and then more concretely, like today, essentially, you don't need to own a factory, or you don't want to own any productive asset in order to exploit someone else, right? You essentially need to have a house that you haven't even paid for. You walk into a bank, you leverage to get a mortgage on another unit, and then you start extracting, surplus value from whoever is living in that unit. So I think there is something to be said about the real estate industry and tenant becoming more and more an equivalent of the sort of the traditional boss and workers perspective analysis. But there's a second and sort of shorter explanation to my using the term class and trying to advance this notion of a tenant class. It's because I find we are a bit too fragmented on the social movement front right now. And I think we need like larger umbrella kind of movements where we can sort of all come in and keep a straightforward aim at the capitalist class. And I think there is a tradition of Latin American and writers to sort of bastardize Marxist concepts as long and sort of in a kind of politically instrumental way. We sort of have been less worried about fitting with the theoretical debates and a little bit more instrumental in using those terms and adapting to our reality and running with it as long as it is politically useful and can advance emancipatory projects. So whether or not I'm right to use the term this way, I think the Marxist gods will forgive me eventually, because I think it's politically useful.
Sure. No, I think it is useful because I guess the way I thought about it when I was reading is we have maybe in an era of more yes, fragmented movements, but a lower degree of organizing in the workplace, for example. We have lower unionization levels, and I really thought, like, thinking about that as like, tenant class and the kind of tenant organizing you talk about in the book as almost like it's a new locus for joining movements together, because I mean there's only ever going to be more renters, it feels like.
Yes, it looks that way.
It actually kind of touched on the other question I had written down, but I guess before that, I mean, this episode's about Pierre Poilievre, right? And we've got the federal election coming up next year. And I'm hearing this phrase, build the homes, build the homes, build the homes, coming out of his campaign right now. And it's not distinct from what other parties are saying across the spectrum. Maybe the methods are slightly different. I know he's talking a lot about funding to municipalities and things like that, and they don't like the Housing Accelerator Fund, I think, that Trudeau's government have been talking about. But I think generally we're often told that it's the regulations and protections for renters and that disincentivize house building and restrict supply. And then potentially the other side of that is as well, we have on the demand side pressures such as immigration that people are saying are drastically increasing aggregate demand for housing. And it just feels like at all levels of government, we're hearing that both of these factors are increasing rent prices and house prices. And that if we just deliver like rapid house building at any cost, rents and house prices will come down, more supply, lower prices. But you say that supply is important, but it's not sufficient. So I was wondering if you could talk a bit about what you mean by this, and maybe some of the better solutions that could deliver for renters.
Yes, that's the biggest lie Canadians are told every single day, that we can build a bunch of housing and that will bring prices to stabilize or maybe even drop. And it's based on the simplistic notion of supply and demand, this notion that we have too many people and not enough housing, so we can just build more and we will arrive at some level of equilibrium where, thereafter everyone's going to live happily ever after. What that analysis ignores completely is the fact that it's not people chasing houses, it's capital, and like big capital chasing land and housing. So what we have is real financial asset managers, international and domestic, large corporate landlords, pension funds, even small investors buying the second or third property to generate rent revenue, and even first-time first-time home buyers who have access to too much credit, as we discussed just now. All of that money is chasing housing and inflating prices when it comes to the purchases of homes, and introducing a more predatory dynamic in the rental housing market, because the financial investors, when they purchase an apartment building, not in any way to romanticize smaller landlords, but when large financial investors purchase an apartment building, they need to show that they can, reposition, the term used, that asset and increase the amount of revenue that the assets generates. And there's only one way of doing this, which is increasing rents and finding a way to really to increase them and to continually increase them, and to go back to their shareholders and say, here, look what we did. It's a great investment. Give us even more capital, and we're going to do it again and again and again and again. So this is the real problem. So governments have two options here. They can buy into the supply and demand argument and just kind of reinforce the narrative, and then that translates to subsidies and tax breaks and all sorts of supports to the real estate industry, which is really powerful. It translates to not touching land taxation and land laws, which are really, really, really the sort of what is the term? they're hard not to crack, right? It's just like the really difficult one to go after. And then you go to prospective first time home buyers and you give them more credit and say, here, a little bit more credit and better mortgage conditions, go you get yourself a home. None of this it's helping. It's mostly making the problem worse, but you remain popular. You project the image that you're doing something. Alternatively, you could put really strict rent controls in place. You could try to go to and touch the land question, which is always extremely controversial. And then you could tell first prospective home buyers that they cannot get that much credit because that's not sustainable. And then you'll never be elected again to anything. So consistently, politicians are choosing the first option. And we have this sort of a whole set of media outlets and, independent pundits and real estate industry pundits who are just too happy to participate in that conversation and to continue to talk about supply. And the last thing I'll say is we do need to continue to build houses. There's no question of, housing availability is important, but we have the misleading argument is that housing, the increased supply alone will bring prices down. And it won't, and it hasn't, and there's no reason to believe it will, other than the kind of political, the political usefulness of that argument.
That's really interesting. So I guess in this, if you were, obviously it's politically unpopular, but if there was an ideal system, would it be a system in which there are a lot more renters? If it is the case that it's a very, is the ideal system a system where there's a lot less emphasis on you taking on the risk of investing in your security through housing and asset investment, and a far greater emphasis on renting, and then a strong general social safety net in terms of pensions and other kind of healthcare and other kinds of social security? Like, what would the end game be?
Yes. Yeah, to speak in terms of your audience, we will understand and appreciate, is like it's focusing on the use value, not an exchange value of housing, right? Mm-hmm. So in practice, that means taking profit out of the equation, whether it's for renting or ownership. Is almost an idiotic debate that we have every single day in Canada. Like, why is housing not affordable? Well, we have so many rules, laws, and institutions protecting profit and ensuring investors that they will get good returns on the real estate investments. How could we expect housing to be affordable? That has never been designed in that way. So the way around this is really to try to remove and in the meantime limit profit in housing. So strict rent controls would do that, and also would investing in more non-market housing. And non-market housing, it's a huge can of worms here, because you're talking about co-ops, you're talking about social housing, you're talking about non-for-profit housing, you're talking about even potentially like homes to own that can be developed in a way where the owners of the house own the structure and not the land. The land remains public, so they can use the house back to use value. They can use the housing, they can enjoy housing security and have a sense of autonomy and independence, but they cannot speculate with that asset, because the land, which is the actual thing that gains value over time, cannot be sold because it doesn't belong to them, right? So there is a number of ways of doing non-market housing. So that should, be our focus. And here's where it gets politically sort of like a little bit gray. There's a lot of kind of the traditional social reformists out there saying we need more non-market housing, and governments are sort of, starting to repeat that too and acknowledge that. But my fear, and And it's something that I talked to a couple of social movements about. I think Frappou in Quebec has a pretty clear-eyed understanding of this as well, is that we have to be careful that non-for-profit housing comes to replace social housing, right? Because even in the sort of the most liberal kind of residual welfare state kind of perspective, as I mentioned at the very opening, there is this room for providing social housing for a very small share of the population, right? So I fear that when governments now say, yeah, let's invest in non-market housing, they're actually trying to find a way to replace social housing with not-for-profits. And the difference is, for not-for-profits, you can just give some capital infrastructure funding, but you're not in the hook for the ongoing social support that social housing residents often need, right? So it's kind of like a hands-off approach to doing social housing. So whereas, a more fundamental restructure of the system would be to keep a share of social housing without the supports and program funding that it needs, and then have a big share of the renter stock to be not-for-profit. But then not-for-profit housing would be replacing the private stock, not the social housing stock. So we have to be careful there, and it gets pretty crazy when you're at these conferences and people, the pundits like myself and that's like professional civil society. You kind of don't know what you're talking about, and then the Scotia Bank's publishing a report on non-market housing and how great there is, and you're like, what? And so that's kind of where the debate is right now, I think.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah, that's interesting. So it's important to have the non-market housing, but it can't be. I guess it's we're talking about nationalizing land to an extent, right? It's like you've got to have some land that is for society and not for speculation. It sounds like.
Yeah, land is the big land is the one that we never talk about, and then that's where this really kind of both source of the problem and the kind of the way out of the problem. It's what we do with land.
Yeah.
Right. We talk a lot about housing, but the housing, the physical infrastructure of a house is much like a car, right? The more you drive, the less it's worth it, and it starts having problems and you have to maintain and it gets really old and it's more maintenance costs. And eventually you have to demolish that thing, right? So the physical structure of a house is not gaining value over time, it's depreciating. What's gaining value is the land underneath it.
Mm-hmm.
It's the land economics that it's largely disregarded, intentionally or not, depending on who's talking, and completely overlooked in the whole supply and demand, the kind of the facile supply and demand explanations.
Yeah, and I guess that's why it's so baked into the imagination of Canada, right? It's like your own little plot of land just for you that you own, which is why, I mean, you just said it earlier, right? It's why it's so, I guess, so politically unpopular, because if a government tries to get in and tries to do this stuff, it sounds like people are not going to like it. So in that case, where does the change happen? And I guess in the book you're talking about tenant organizing. Is that where we create the change we need? Is that where it happens? And how has that happened throughout history?
Yes, tenant organizing and more broadly political organizing, a movement that articulates demands and pushes for them and doesn't waste time in the policy debates. The Canadian civil society is spending way too much energy and resources and time on this official consultations and engagement with the powers of the day, instead of just articulating a vision and saying this is what we want, and this is what we're going to go for. Spring is great. It's a wonderful exception in that entire landscape. Professional civil society organizations that are a bit too willing to spend weeks and weeks focused on some government consultation, they know we'll go nowhere. They know we'll deliver nothing. But as long as their metrics of their success, it's face time with politicians, which they confuse for influence over politicians, as long as the entire focus is on begging for concessions, instead of being in a position to make demands, that won't change. And I gave a practical example. I mentioned spring as a wonderful exception, but the other day I picked up the phone and I talked to Islam, is the syndicat des locataires autonomes de Montréal. They also go by MATU, Montreal Autonomous Tenant Union, and they're fairly new. I didn't mention them in the English version of the book, but I'm finishing the French version, and I wanted to talk about them. So I pick up the phone and I call one of the organizers, and we're chatting, and then I ask one of the basic questions, which is, at this point, are you engaging with politicians, with elected officials, either the municipal level or the provincial level there in Quebec? And he had such a great and straightforward answer. And he said, why would we? At this point, we have no power to demand anything. Why would we sit at a table to essentially beg or listen to what they have to say to us, or perhaps legitimize whatever process that they are having? Why would we do that? We're just focusing on building more and more and more power. Once the rapport de force is different, once we're in a position to make some kind of demand, yes, then we want to talk to them, but not for now. And I love that, because it was so simple and it was such a kind of a clear-eyed answer to my question. And yet I find it so uncommon to hear that in my everyday work.
Yeah, absolutely. Because policy can get really lost in the technical details, but at the end of the day, it's getting enough people, from our point of view, and this is what we're doing with the fighting the right, is enough people to recognize it's in their interests to fight this kind of stuff. This financialization is obviously not working, and it's not in the benefits of all of us. So no, I think that's a hugely important perspective. Yeah, thank you so much for chatting to us. This was honestly a great conversation just for me. I really had a good time. Thank you so much.
Likewise. Thanks for having me. I'm a big fan of Spring, and always happy to participate in anything you guys organize or anything you guys invite me to.
Thank you, Josh and Ricardo, for an insightful interview. You can order the Tenant Class from Between the Lines Books or pick up a copy at your local indie bookstore. To stay updated on how you can support the tenants at Windflowers, follow Friends of Chinatown Toronto on Instagram at Friends of Chinatown. This episode was produced on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishnabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. Produced by Josh Frame, Spencer Bridgman, and me, Ayan Tani, with original music by Benjamin Bilgan. To read and listen to more from Spring, and to find out how to join the Spring Socialist Network, visit springmag.ca.